I thought we might just jump right into how breathing is different for women. This is something that has been known for a long time. And of course, research is really sparse. And I would love for you to expand on, first explain how the breathing is different for women. And then we can sort of get into some of the nuances around menstrual cycle irregularities and perimenopause and menopause. But let's start off with how breathing is different for women.
Yeah, of course. I suppose to answer that question, we have to look at the different dimensions of breathing. And when we think about breathing, very often people think about the diaphragm, and that takes a lot of attention. But there's three main dimensions to breathing. You have the biochemical dimension, which is focusing around carbon dioxide and the body's sensitivity to that gas, which ultimately, of course, carbon dioxide is the primary driver to breathe. And I will come back to that. And also then we have the biomechanics, and we have airway itself. And then we have the psychophysiological aspect, which is the mind-body connection. So whenever we think about our everyday breathing patterns, we need to look at it from those three different perspectives. Now, in terms of female breathing, it's been known since 1915 that women hyperventilate during different phases of the monthly cycle. So, for example, menstruation, then there's the follicular phase, proliferation, ovulation, and after ovulation and mid-luteal phase, there's an increase in progesterone, there's an increase in estrogen, and progesterone is a hormone that stimulates breathing. So breathing during that time, mid-luteal phase, is going to be a little bit faster and possibly a little bit harder. And that in turn then causes a lowering of the gas carbon dioxide from the lungs because we breathe out too much of it. And that in turn then reduces carbon dioxide in the blood leaving the lungs. And when carbon dioxide leaves the blood, is lower in the blood vessels constrict, so blood vessels narrow. And there's also reduced oxygen delivery throughout the body based on what's called the Bohr effect. So if you think of, say, a female, and say she has not particularly good breathing anyway, but post-ovulation, mid-luteal phase, now she's got an increase in progesterone, which is stimulating her breathing. And now she's got an exaggerated breathing response on top of her already relatively poor breathing. This can lower carbon dioxide by as much as 25%. And that's huge because that in turn would reduce blood flow to the brain, for example. That would increase anxiety. That would increase panic disorder. That would contribute to fatigue. And there's a host of different symptoms associated with chronic hyperventilation. And see, the thing is, it's not obvious. It's not that she's having a panic attack in front of us. Like that's the kind of extreme ends of the scale. It's just that her breathing is a bit faster and a bit harder. And it seems to be the women with the increased sensitivity to the gas carbon dioxide that has the most pronounced change in their breathing patterns. And they also, in a very, very understudied area, also seem to have the most PMS symptoms. So, in other words, there could be a connection between the symptoms of premenstrual syndrome and hyperventilation, in that the symptoms cross over. And then one begs the question, well, what about if you controlled your breathing? What about if the female was aware that she could be likely to be hyperventilating or breathing just a bit faster and harder at this point? She might be feeling air hunger. She might be feeling that she's not getting enough air. And of course, if you're not thinking about your breathing, you'll kind of naturally respond by taking a few bigger breaths. But that doesn't do anything to help the problem. Yes, it gets rid of air hunger, but it also gets rid of the gas carbon dioxide. And that's the very thing that we want to address. So I think it could be very interesting. We've seen it with our instructors over the years as well. Their breathing may be pretty okay during menstruation, the follicular phase, proliferation, ovulation, and then mid-luteal phase. Their breathing does get that bit faster and harder. But it depends. It's going to vary female to female. But if a female is kind of paying attention to her breathing in line with the phases of the monthly cycle, she may pick up that there's a connection there.
So you mentioned if she's not breathing well, and I don't think that we have parameters around what that looks like. So can you define what good breathing might be for the listener?
Sure. If you were to assess it with validated scales, so for example, I said there were three dimensions without complicating it. The biochemical dimension is the sensitivity to carbon dioxide. Now that has huge implications for females and men. Because if we are overly sensitive to the accumulation of this gas, which we produce internally anyway, and it's not true that we breathe out the waste carbon dioxide, we only breathe out about 15% of what the body produces. Carbon dioxide itself serves a number of very, very important functions in the human body. But if we have poor breathing from a biochemical point of view, we will have a low breath hold time. So, for example, we use a test. One from the Buteyko technique is called the control pause. And the other then from Oxygen Advantage, it's a similar test. It's called BOLT, body oxygen level test. Now, all that involves is that she sits down for, say, 2 or 3 minutes with normal breathing in and out through her nose. And then she takes a normal breath in through her nose and a normal breath out through her nose, pinches her nose and stops breathing, and times it in seconds. How long does it take until she feels the first definite desire to breathe? Or how long does it take until she feels the first involuntary contractions of the diaphragm? Now, an easier way to think of it might be this. How long can you hold your breath for after a normal exhalation and still have normal breathing when you resume breathing? So where would you like to be with that figure? It should be in around 25 seconds. If you're above 25 seconds, it indicates functional breathing. If you're below 25 seconds, it indicates dysfunctional breathing. Now, here's an interesting connection. Your length of breath hold time is an indirect measure of your sensitivity to carbon dioxide. And there is a connection between the sensitivity of the carbon dioxide and the autonomic nervous system. So the connection there is that if you have a strong chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide, you have a low breath hold time. So if you have a low breath hold time, it indicates you have a strong sensitivity to carbon dioxide. But there's also the connection in terms of if you have a strong sensitivity to carbon dioxide, you have reduced sensitivity of the baroreflex. And that also would feed into an autonomic nervous system that's in an increased stress response. So we do see a connection between breathing patterns and breath hold time and heart rate variability. And that, of course, is going to have implications as well, right across the board, both male and female. But I think really with females, because, even though I said that females breathe differently, which they do, I've only pointed so far on the biochemical dimension of breathing. Females have smaller airways than men. Now, I think where it's got two implications. One is during physical exercise. If you've got a smaller pipe, so I'm talking about the space at the back of the nose where it meets the throat, and the throat itself, so at the back of the mouth where it meets the throat, and then the throat itself, just to keep it simple. If that pipe is smaller, there's an increased resistance to breathe. It takes more effort to breathe. You have to work harder to breathe. And that has got implications during physical exercise. And another aspect then is, of course, the airway is very important during sleep. And females are very susceptible to what's called upper airway resistance syndrome. Now, you could spend all day talking about this condition. And even back as far as 1995, the founding father of sleep medicine said that women were the forgotten gender when it comes to sleep. Now, it's not that I'm going off on a tangent. There is a connection between sleep and breathing and the autonomic nervous system. Depending on the age of the female, it's going to have application.
All right, so let me just recap what you said there. So if we are doing that whole test, let's say, so you breathe in, you breathe out, you hold your nose, and we're trying to get to 25 seconds or above. If someone's listening and they do that and they are not able to get to 25 seconds without having to take in, huge amounts of air afterwards, is that person going to be more susceptible to some of the symptoms that we see in the cluster of PMS? So more anxiety, maybe more sleep disturbances, more mood and affect changes, even changes in digestion and bloating and inflammation. Is that person at a higher risk for that? Or is there a direct corollary there?
There seems to be. It's very understudied. The only paper that I can find that really looked at that in detail was a 2006 paper. So try one 2006 paper, and it's just looking at 3 cases. And the researchers looked at these 3 individuals with severe symptoms of PMS. And they found that all 3 women had a heightened sensitivity to carbon dioxide. So that pretty much means that those women are going to be hyperventilating. And if you hyperventilate over a period of time, it really has an effect on the body. The symptoms you described there, but also stress, anxiety, panic disorder, headaches, Because if you think about if you're breathing a bit faster and a bit harder than what you should be, your 50,000 miles of blood vessels are narrowing. But it's not only your blood vessels narrow. What also happens is that when you're blowing off too much carbon dioxide from the lungs and reducing it in the blood, hemoglobin then holds onto oxygen too strongly and doesn't release oxygen so readily. So there, for example, you could have a female then, and maybe she's prone to the symptoms of fibromyalgia. And fibromyalgia is a syndrome with different symptoms, and part of that can include pain, for example. So she goes for a walk, and during that time she's hyperventilating. It might be only a 20-minute walk, but then when she has to go back to bed because she's such an increase in lactic acid. See, if you hyperventilate, it doesn't mean that there's more oxygen getting to the working muscles. It means that there's less.
Yeah.
Less oxygen. That's the thing about breathing as well, Stephanie. Like, people have an idea about breathing that the more air you breathe, the better. That's not true. It's the same as water. It's the same as food. It's pretty much the same as anything with a human being. It's all about balance. And I think most people, on the face of it, they realize that, yes, there has been a time in their life that, yes, they were taking these full, deep breaths. They were taking big breaths. They might have been slowing down their breathing, but they were feeling lightheaded as a result. That's not a sign that there's an increased oxygen and blood flow in the body. That's a sign that's the opposite.
And so when we think about some of the things that may be cyclical for the menstrual cycle, so things like migraines, even individuals with asthma sometimes will report, the luteal phase versus the follicular, like different, symptoms or even just severity of asthma attacks or wheezing and coughing. Can we see those things? Is there like a predictable pattern that we can see over the course of the menstrual cycle then with some of these things that are seemingly unrelated, right? It's like, how is asthma related to, my menstrual cycle? But we can sort of pin that, or we can relate it to the way that the individual is breathing and whether or how sensitive they are to the carbon dioxide.
Oh, totally. Absolutely.